Hello, I'm Chris Blakely, and I'm the instructor for Philosophy 3090 on Nietzsche this semester. And just wanted to make a quick little video to preview some of what we'll be up to this semester. I think this is maybe the um, fifth or sixth time that I've taught the course on Nietzsche here at LSU, and I'm pretty sure I've done it differently every time. There are a lot of different ways to approach Nietzsche's philosophy, so I just wanted to give people a little bit of a preview about what we'll be up to uh, this semester. So, as you probably know, Nietzsche is a German thinker, lived in the 19th century from 1844 to 1900. He was trained as a philologist and a classicist, but is often known as a philosopher, although he himself described himself as the first psychologist. And this course is in the philosophy department. So, what we'll do is look at Nietzsche's major works, studied in the context of the three periods of the productivity and evolution of his thought. So, over the course of his career, while he was writing, from some of his earliest works to some of his latest works. Now, Nietzsche hasn't always been considered or accepted as part of the kind of Western canon in academic philosophy. He's the kind of thinker whose philosophy challenges our ideas about what philosophy is and how to go about doing it. And he espouses views that many other canonical figures in philosophy, particularly Western philosophy, reject. And because of the controversy surrounding him, he just hasn't always been included, in the kind of academic curriculum of philosophy. But we are going to study him here for his controversial aspects. So, Nietzsche is a deeply controversial figure. There are other controversial figures in philosophy, and many of them may seem tame to us, but were controversial in the time that they were writing. Um, even if they're quite conservative for us these days, but that's not really the case with Nietzsche. He's well recognized as a very controversial figure, and is often, claimed as inspiration for, probably a lot of people you might not like. Um, Alt-right figures and the Nazis, employed, drew inspiration from Nietzsche and propagandized using Nietzsche's work. Here we have a picture of Hitler admiring a bust of Nietzsche. He's inspired other people like Leopold and Loeb, who committed a murder. So why would we study Nietzsche? Isn't he a horrible person? Aren't his ideas contemptible and these sorts of things? And every few years there is a controversy over whether to study or cancel Nietzsche that seems to pop up. Most recently, a college in London wanted to ban the Nietzsche Club, and um, I think it was out in California and UCLA. The Nietzsche Club was banned, because Nietzsche is allegedly fascist, sexist, and homophobic. And of course, many religious people have been deeply troubled by Nietzsche for a long, long time. So yes, Nietzsche is a very controversial figure. I think it's worth pointing out, that he drew inspiration, or people across the political, socio-political, and cultural spectrum have drawn inspiration from his ideas, including people that certainly couldn't be considered fascist, but rather anarchist, like Emma Goldman here, who wants to point out, that Nietzsche was not a social theorist, but a poet, a rebel, and an innovator. His aristocracy, and Nietzsche talks a lot about aristocratic values. She says he was neither of birth nor of the purse. It's not heritage or not by wealth. It's of the spirit. In this respect, Nietzsche is an anarchist, and all true anarchists were aristocrats of this sort, she thinks, right? And so, again, Nietzsche has inspired many people across the spectrum, including some, again, that we might not sit too well with. One way to approach Nietzsche's philosophy is certainly just to look at what he has to say about the big questions in academic philosophy. So here we have, a little diagram, a little mind map of the basic subfields of academic philosophy and the basic questions that you study in philosophy, like what is real, what is beauty, or what is art, how do we reason, what are the principles of correct reasoning, how should we govern ourselves as a society, how do we know things, and what is of value to us personally and in our personal lives, how should we live. And so again, one way to think about Nietzsche is to think about what his arguments are in regard to these sorts of issues, these kind of classical philosophical problems. He does have things to say about those. And so one of the things we'll want to do is look at what Nietzsche has to say about some of those classic philosophical questions and what kind of arguments he gives regarding them. And on that front, Nietzsche continues to influence lots of academic philosophers in contemporary European philosophy, the Anglophone world of philosophy, and comparative philosophy between different cultures as well. So, certainly, although he hasn't always been considered part of the canon in academic philosophy, he certainly is, I think, now regarded that way and continues to, influence and inspire and serve as a target for, many other scholars. So, that's one way to approach Nietzsche's philosophy, just in terms of theoretical philosophy. What does he have to say about the theoretical problems of academic philosophy? Another way that we will consider approaching Nietzsche's philosophy is in terms of a philosophy as a way of life rather than just an academic discipline or an abstract theoretical discipline. So, contemporary philosopher John Sellers helps flesh out this idea a little bit. Nietzsche himself was quite critical of the academic philosophy of his day and previous philosophers that we recognize as part of, the Western philosophical thought. He was quite critical of those philosophers and what they thought they were up to. But he endorsed, as we'll see here in a second, this way of thinking of philosophy as a way of life, and this idea of philosophy, practical philosophy, floats around and intersects with academic philosophy all the time. It's probably closer to what many students would like to get out of a philosophy class than maybe the way it's often approached in academia, where it is more, academic and theoretical, and we're interested in, the questions for their own sake and the answers for their own sake, not necessarily how they might impact our daily lives. You're right, but just the theoretical answers themselves for their own sake. But practical philosophy, philosophy of a way of life, is committed to this idea of self transformation. And so Sellers tries to flush out this notion of philosophy as a way of life. And I'll come back to this later in another lecture. But here he says, I take it to involve the following things. First, the ultimate motivation of philosophy is to transform one's way of life. Second, that there ought to be some connection or consistency between someone's stated philosophical ideas and their behavior. And third, that actions are ultimately more philosophically significant than words. It's often conceived as something therapeutic, but it need not be. It usually aims at the good life, but again, this may not necessarily be so. It is transformative, though perhaps one ought not to assume that this will always be for the better. It resonates with what um, Isaiah Berlin called the power of ideas. That is, the ability of philosophy to transform the life of an individual or even an entire society. As he put it, the concepts and the categories with which people think must deeply affect their lives. So that's Sellers on this notion of philosophy as a way of life, practical philosophy, not simply the way we often approach it in academia. And I mentioned before that Nietzsche was quite critical of academic philosophy, but he does, in places, seem to endorse a notion of philosophy as a way of life. So he says, I attach importance to a philosopher only to the extent that he is capable of setting an example. The philosopher must supply his example in his visible life and not merely in his books. That is, it must be presented in a way the philosophers of Greece taught, through facial expressions, demeanor, clothing, food, and custom, more than through what they said, let alone what they wrote. It comes from Nietzsche's essay Schopenhauer as Educator, which we'll read a little bit later here in the semester. And so we'll be thinking about this idea of theoretical philosophy as well as practical, or philosophy as a way of life, as we consider Nietzsche's philosophy and the way it develops over the course of his career. And so we will be reading excerpts from a lot of his major works, from Birth of Tragedy, one of his earliest works on what is ostensibly aesthetics, right? We'll talk about music a little bit. Untimely Meditations, Human All Too Human, Daybreak, The Joyful Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morals, Twilight of the Idols, Antichrist, and his autobiography, Ecce Homo. We'll be looking at excerpts from all of those. We'll spend a little bit more time on some books than others, but we're going to go through quite a bit of stuff to get a sense of how Nietzsche develops his ideas, both in regard to questions in theoretical philosophy, but also his notion of philosophy as a way of life. What would the Nietzschean way of life look like? and what are the doctrines or ideas associated with that way of life. How are we to best understand those? And so, as we go through all those works, there are several main themes that you got to try and keep in mind, because Nietzsche references his other works, and these themes are kind of in the background of almost everything going on all the time. So, lots to look out for here, including pessimism and nihilism, the distinction between life affirming and life denying attitudes, perspectivism and truth, art, tragedy, and existence, culture and cultural decline or decadence, the death of God, the overman and self creation, the eternal return, the critique of morality, the critique of religion, and his notion of slave morality, this controversial idea, the will to power, and his love of fate, amor fati. So we'll be worried about all of those key themes and key ideas as we take a look at what Nietzsche had to say in most of his major works. And two of the most basic questions that we'll just worry about here this semester is what is exactly Nietzsche's philosophy and what have scholars said about it. So we'll pay a little bit of attention to some secondary literature. We've got one additional work outside of about Nietzsche's philosophy to read this semester as well, and then we'll worry again about his answers to theoretical questions in philosophy, as in particularly what he has to say about philosophy as a way of life. And then we have to worry about whether this is a coherent, plausible, or reasonable, or possibly true view, or is it fallacious, relativistic, self-contradictory? Does it amount to just sophistry? Remember, I said at the outset that Nietzsche's way of doing philosophy seems to raise questions about what philosophy is and how best to go about it. The academic philosophers usually follow Socrates and distinguish themselves from the sophist, but Nietzsche praises the sophist. So again, we'll have quite a lot to think about this semester as we turn to examine Nietzsche's philosophy and how it develops over the course of his career. I'm really looking forward to this semester. I hope y'all are too, and I hope this gives you just a little bit of a preview of some of the things that we'll be up to this semester. I will see y'all around.